Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today I'm going to show you how to turn a wine glass. It's a fun, simple project that doesn't require a lot of materials, so let's get turning. For this project, I'm going to be using a 3x3 by 4.5 inch blank. If you turn more than one, you can go with a little bit shorter piece, but for the first one, we'll be using part of this as a jam chuck, so make sure the first piece is a little bit longer than the others. I'm going to start by mounting my 4-prong drive center in my chuck jaws. This saves me time later because I don't have to remove the chuck from the lathe. Go ahead and snug that up. I'm going to go ahead and mark the center on here. I'm just going to eyeball it. Usually if you eyeball it and then adjust your dot, you can see where it's off. And that looks pretty good there. Go ahead and mount that on your 4-prong drive. Bring up your tailstock for support. Then go ahead and snug the quill down. And we'll set up our tool rest for a standard working height. Adjust that so it doesn't contact the tool rest. I'm going to be just below center because I'll be using my spindle roughing gouge to knock this down to round, and I want to have the handle slightly lower than your other tools. With this one I'm going to be having the flute slightly closed. So make sure that spin's clear, and you can go ahead and turn this on. To rough this out, I'm about 1400 RPM, and we'll just slowly ease the corners off the blank. Whenever I use a spindle roughing gouge, I usually keep my thumb over the flute just to prevent chips from flying up, or I'll put my hand over top of the flute just to block the chips from going down your shirt. If you need to, as that center point starts sinking into the wood fibers, go ahead and snug that up just a little bit. Go ahead and adjust your tool rest in to make sure you have proper support for the tool. Alright, I'm going to go to where we're just about round. Now we can bump up our lathe speed now that we're true. And then I'll be using my skew as a peel cut here to give ourselves a tenon for the chuck. So I'm going to drop the handle and ride the bevel, and then I'm going to raise the handle to make the cut. Go ahead and true up the end of the tenon, that way if it does touch the chuck, everything's seating square. And I'm going to lengthen that tenon about 1/16 of an inch. Because I plan on using this end of the blank later as a jam chuck, I want to make sure my tenon's really good so I can reuse that later on. Go ahead and remove that, and we'll mount it in our 4-jaw chuck. The nice thing about mounting that 4-prong in the chuck is it just makes it a lot quicker instead of removing the chuck on and off a bunch of times throughout the process. Go ahead and snug that down on both pinion gears, make sure everything's nice and snug. And I'm also, while I'm here, I'm going to mark my jaw slide number 4 right here, and then the corner of each jaw on the blank. That way, once I part this off and use it as a jam chuck and I can take it in and out of the chuck, I can remount it in the same spot and it'll stay true. So I'll show you that once we get a little further on. You'll understand what I'm talking about. So I'm going to bring up my tailstock for support here, make sure everything clears, and then go ahead and snug everything down. I want to do most of the rough turning before I drill the hole in there. That way I have stability from the revolving center, and everything will just be a little more secure when we do the heavier roughing cuts. So now that we've got our blank mounted on the tenon, we've marked our jaws so we can remount the piece, we can go ahead and rough this down to round. I'm going to outline my overall length of the piece, and I will need to true up the end, so I'm going to give myself about 1/8 inch of waste. And then right about there should be our overall length. You can either use the spindle roughing gouge to get rid of the bulk of the material. It's a really fast way to get rid of a lot of material. Or you can use your skew as a peel cut and do a bunch of steps to give yourself a rough outline. My skew's getting a little dull, so I'm going to switch back to my spindle roughing gouge. Just cut those steps down. Make sure you're on that bevel or else it'll skate. And you get really big chips with a spindle roughing gouge, which is cool. So make sure you're on the bevel. And now I'm going to remove my tailstock and adjust my tool rest slightly in. And square up the face. Oh, make sure you're on the bevel. I have some tool marks from the 4-prong drive center right here, so I want to make sure I remove those. And then I'll give myself a small dimple for my drill bit. Now we can go ahead and drill this out. And the stem on the glassware uses a 3/8 drill bit. Because these are handmade, you might want to test fit your bit because they might vary slightly. But 3/8 will be good. Give me enough room for some good epoxy in there when we glue the base to the glass. So remove your revolving center and bring up your drill chuck with your 3/8 bit. I'm using a keyless chuck, and I'm going to drop my speed down for drilling about 1,000 RPM. Let that bit find center, and then once it's in the wood, you can go ahead and drill that out. Double check my depth on the stem. And that's perfect. Now I'm going to flare the opening just a hair to match the contour of the glass. That'll help register the glass and seat it in there nice and square when we glue it in. Bump your speed back up to about 2,000. And I'll be cutting just on the bottom wing of the tool here, just as a scrape, just to open that up a little bit. Now let's check that contour to the glass. Alright, so this one's a little bit different shape than the last one I turned. Make sure I clear the shavings out of there. And it looks like, I think I'm registering in the bottom of the hole. I'm going to drill that just a little bit deeper. I think I'm bottoming out on the glass stem. I don't think I drilled it deep enough. So I'm going to bump my speed down again. Go ahead and drill out just another 1/4 inch or so is all it should need. I can check it now. Okay. I'm going to open up that flare just a little bit more of a taper so I register a little higher on the glass. Turn your speed back up. And that should be good to go. Okay, that'll look really good when it's glued in. So now we can go ahead and refine our shape, get our final curve and details, and if we're going to do any detail cuts there on the base as well. But I'll remove my drill chuck, bring in my revolving center again, and I can mount that in the drilled hole for a little extra support. That'll help prevent the chatter once we start getting down to a smaller diameter and give us just the extra support we need there to make some clean cuts without vibration and chatter. So turn your speed back up. I'm going to my 1/2 inch spindle gouge here. The shape I'm going for is this one here. Just a nice simple curve with a couple detail beads and a little fillet at the top. I'm starting with that flute closed until I'm on the bevel, and then I open it up just a hair. Right now, if I go in there with the flute open, it's going to skate back on me and catch the top wing. So make sure your flute's closed over until you're on the bevel and you're making contact. The other thing too is I want to swing that bevel around to make the curve. So I'm starting with the bevel pointing this direction, and then I swing the handle, and that bevel is making that curve for me. I'm going to establish my fillet at the top, and then we can start working our overall diameter down. And I want to be very careful here because from the end of the fillet to about here we have a 3/8 drilled hole running through the wood. So you don't want to go too thin or else you'll turn right through the material. But my spindle gouge is getting dull, so I'm going to go ahead and hit the grinder. Alright, so I just hit the grinder. I've got a really good edge now on my spindle gouge. I'm just refining my curve here. Just swinging that tool handle, letting the bevel ride the surface and give me the curve that I'm looking for on this piece. It cuts really good until I get to about here, and then I'm hitting end grain. That's why it's peeling those fibers up. So then I'm going to come in from this direction to clean those up. Alright, so I've got my basic curve here. I want to start refining this shape now and transitioning it to the base curve. I'm about, I'd say 3/4, 5/8 there. I've got a fair amount of material I can still remove, and then I'm going to reduce the overall diameter of this as well. I think it's just a little bit too big. Okay, I think that looks a little better. I'm going to lengthen that fillet out just a hair. And you could go with like a half round or a fillet or a full bead there if you wanted to. Just play around with different style and shape. That was a bad cut there. You saw just kind of tore into the fibers a little bit. Alright, so right here I'm just over a 1/2 inch in diameter, which means I've got an 1/8 of an inch wall. So if you split that between each side, I've got a 1/16, so I don't want to go too much narrower than right here. So now I'm just going to refine this a little bit without taking too much more material off, because I can hear the sound is changing as well as soon as I start getting thinner, because that drilled hole there. One thing you can do as well with your spindle roughing gouge is you can ride the bevel, and it's a little less pressure on that thin wall because I'm cutting on the wing, because I'm going to roll the tool over and I'm cutting on this front leading wing here, but on the bevel, so it's a controlled cut as well. That's just a little more controllable than the spindle gouge when I'm over the rest like this, and it imparts less pressure onto the wood. My spindle roughing gouge is fairly dull as well, which doesn't help. But I'm happy with that. Let's go ahead and refine this curve now. Ooh, got a little skate there because I had that flute too far open. It caught and just pulled it back on me. I think what I might actually do is transition that curve there to a little fillet. Give it a little break in the curve. I think that might look kind of nice. I kind of like that shape. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you like this shape better, the standard curve with the detail coves there, or the OG to a half radius? Whenever I get down into the bottom of a cut where it's a really sharp corner, I raise the tool handle and I roll that flute completely closed. That way it's cutting just on the tip of the tool. This is getting a little big to get in there to make that curve, and I'm getting a fair amount of bevel contact there, so I'm going to switch to my smaller 3/8 to make the curve I need. And then I'm going to transition, roll the flute over, and I'm going to cut the fillet. And just get in there and make sure that's a nice, crisp detail down in the bottom. I'm going to reduce the diameter of this and this at the same time and bring those down just a little bit. This is just a little chunky and looks a little heavy. So we're going to remove some material just to reduce that diameter. And that'll give us a nice sweeping radius. So that looks good there, and now I'm going to reduce this down just a touch. And then we'll also smooth out that curve. And that's about as narrow as I want to go right here. We're very close to going through that wall. We can refine that just a hair more with some sandpaper, but otherwise, I'm pretty happy with that shape. The nice thing about spindle turning like this is whenever you're using gouges, you leave a really clean surface, and this is going to stand out like that. So I'm happy with our shape we have here. I'm going to go ahead and part down the end here and give ourselves some clearance, and then I'll start radiusing the base here. I want to have a nice radius because when that sits on the table, it lifts the piece off the table and makes it look more delicate than it really is. So it's just a little design feature. So I'm just using the nano parting tool. This is a 30-second wide cut. I really like this parting tool just because it doesn't waste a bunch of material, and I can use this entire chunk for a waste block later. So I'm just parting down, giving myself about a ½ inch of relief. And then we can use our spindle gouge to give us some clearance. And now I can start radiusing the base. Okay, I'm happy with that radius for now. We will adjust that a little bit once we rechuck it. I'm just going to soften up that edge because it is a little sharp. But now that we've got that ready to part off, let's go ahead and sand and get this surface prepped. Alright, so I've dropped our speed down to about half of what we were turning at. I'm actually going to drop it just a little bit slower. Right now I'm at about 1,000 RPM, which is probably a little quick, but we can see how the sandpaper bites into the surface and see if we need to slow it down more. Sandpaper seems to be cutting well. I think that's okay. Just going to use my finger to help me radius and smooth out these curves just a little bit. I want to be very careful sanding my detail because if you over sand it, it'll soften those too much and it reduces how nice it looks. So you don't really want to sand your detail lines, your fillets or your coves at all, because it softens those detail lines up so much. Nice thing about sandpaper, just flick it to unload it. The other nice thing too about this is you can use it wet. Because it does clear when you flick it and you can clear it out, you can use it wet, and then when it clogs up with wet dust, you just wring it out and then you're good to go. And go up to our next grit. Go ahead and inspect the surface and see if there's any marks or torn grain we need to get rid of. I think that looks pretty good. There's just sanding scratches on there. Looks like there might be just a little bit of torn grain there, so we can spot sand that. If you lose your sandpaper, go ahead and grab it. I can't tell you how many pieces of sandpaper I've had sucked into the dust collector because it slips out of your hand and just disappears. And we'll go on to our 400. On this piece I will not be using scratch free or the Yorkshire Grit just because I'm using a spray lacquer finish. I don't want to have to strip the surface of the wax for the lacquer to bond correctly, so I'm not going to use that this time. I will, however, use the non-woven abrasive pad. This is a 2500 grit. This will burnish the surface just a little bit, and if you need to, you can always grab some shavings, and that'll help burnish the surface as well. Alright, let's go ahead and part this down a little more. We can bump our speed back up. Our turning speed around 2000. And with this parting tool in particular, I don't want to get too far over the rest. About 1.5 inches is the max, so I'm going to stop here. I've got a roughly 1 inch diameter piece of waste in the center. And then I'll switch to just a small hand saw to cut this off. I'm also going to reduce the pressure from my tailstock as I cut through this. If I kept the tailstock pressure, a lot of times it makes the saw bind up when you're trying to cut it. So just remove that to where it's just lightly supporting it, and then you can saw that off. So now that we've got the base and the top and the hole drilled out, we're ready to finish the bottom, and then we can go ahead and finish this piece. But that's going to look good when it's done. So what we need to do to mount this is I'm going to turn a small tenon with our waste block. It's going to look just like this. So we're turning a 3/8 tenon on our waste block that we can use to mount our piece onto to return it. So with the tailstock out of the way, we can go ahead and part this down to a 3/8 tenon. I'll be using the skew with a peel cut. Once we get close, I'm going to switch to my spindle gouge to give myself a clean surface here because that's pretty rough and torn out. Tool keeps skating on me. Make sure that flute's closed. Still a little rough. I'm going to pick up the cut. I don't know if you can hear that sound, but that's too much bevel contact, so I need to go a little lighter on the bevel pressure and let the tool do the cut. If you ever slip out of the cut, you can always just come back a little bit and then pick up the cut again. You'll see me do that a fair amount. A lot of times if I'm trying to make a very straight pass and the piece isn't perfectly straight already, it'll come out of the cut, so you can go ahead and just pull the tool back a little bit and then pick it up again. Just reduce the diameter of our tenon. If you want to use your gouge, you can do that as well. I do want to have a nice flat face here though for that piece to reference against. I keep losing that cut. Alright, I think we're getting close. Let's go ahead and test fit. Alright, so we're still probably a 1/16 too big. We want it to be snug enough that we can still turn and finish the bottom of this, but not too tight to where it'll split it when we press it on. Ooh, I think I might have taken just too heavy of a cut there. I'm going to stop it. My bevel angle was in the wrong direction, so it started cutting towards the center, and it would have made the tenon way too small, so I stopped the cut. Fortunately, I recognized that. Now let's go ahead and test fit it. Okay, we're close. One little trick you can do is give yourself a small taper on the very end of the tenon. And then you can hold your piece up against it and see where the burnish line is, and that's the diameter you need to turn to. So I don't know if you guys can see it, but there's a teeny tiny little mark right there, and that's where it was contacting the drilled hole. Another option, if you don't want to have to turn a tenon, you could just get a 3/8 dowel from the hardware store, mount that in a drill chuck. But if you're doing a bunch of these, you can reuse this because we did mark our jaw alignment on here. So if you take it in and out of the chuck, it'll still remain true, which is nice. Like this is one I've been using for a long time. I just keep it on hand. I've got a drawer full of little fixtures and tenon jigs and everything I keep around. So let's go ahead and test the fit. All right, you can see where it's compressing the fibers. So you can see to about right here, it's when I pressed that on, it was compressing these wood fibers. So I'd say just a little bit more material removed, and then we'll be set. If it's compressing fibers that tight already, I know it'll split the piece if I try to press it on. So go ahead and just give it one more pass. All right, let's go ahead and check our fit now. All right, so that's a good fit. If you go to twist it and it sounds like you're crunching snow, that's a good fit. It's not too tight, it's going on and it's seating well. If it was any tighter than that, I would make one more pass to turn it down. When I was doing some of these, I did split one because the first tenon I made was way too tight. So make sure that everything seats well. Give it a spin to see if it's off center. And if it's out around and it's not concentric anymore, give it just a quarter twist and check it. So that made it worse. Give it another quarter twist. And a lot of times you can find a better, more concentric area if you just rotate it around the piece. Okay, so that's not too bad. That's pretty close. We can true up the very base of this as we go ahead and finish the bottom. I think that's concentric enough for this project. Yeah, that's maybe a 1/64 out of center. I think we'll be just fine. But I'm going to go ahead and bring up my tailstock with some light pressure. Make sure everything's turning well, and then I'm going to increase the pressure of my tailstock, and it's just snug. I'm not getting too crazy with it. If I push it in too hard, I might split the blank. So I will, however, unlock my tailstock and extend that out a ways. give myself more room for the banjo on the lathe to move around and get where I need to with the tool rest. So make sure everything's nice and secure and locked down, and then you can go ahead and adjust your tool rest in there. For this, I'll be primarily using the 3/8 spindle gouge to get in there and get the clearance around my my revolving center. Getting a little bit of chatter, I'm just going to increase that pressure just a touch. And for my design on the base, I'm going to concave that a fair amount. I want to remove some of that weight in the bottom of the glass, as well as I like having a nice smooth curve under there, and then the radius to the rim. I think it looks really nice when it sits on the table. So we are making a fair amount of noise because this is getting pretty thin out here. So you want to be very gentle on your bevel contact as well. Adjust my tool rest. I'm going to go ahead and true up this base. Get that tool rest height where I need it. Just trying to get a nice radius curve here. And right now I don't want to have a catch. If I have a catch, most likely it'll chip a huge chunk out of the base. So just be careful when you're making that pass. Do a couple more passes in here to lighten this up, and then we can go ahead and sand it. And make sure the flute is completely closed on these cuts. Right now we don't have enough material to cut out any tear out or torn grain if we have a catch. So just make sure that flute's completely closed before we start our cut. Just trying to give myself a nice smooth curve radius. And then I'm going to part down the waist in the center. And that 3/8 gouge is really the only tool I've got to get in there and make these detail cuts. The 1/2 inch is just too big to get in there, just too big of a tool. Otherwise it'll be contacting that or the revolving center, which I don't want. Rotate the tool over and just start reducing the diameter of that waist piece. And I'm just working it down until I can flip the tool over and make a pass right through the center and cut that nub off. So once I cut the nub off, you saw this thing go out around just a hair. Alright, so now that I've cut the nub off, I can go ahead and sand the base, sand this exterior, and then we'll be ready to put a finish on. This did come a little bit out of true as I took the revolving center away and we parted the nub off, so I just spun it by hand to get it re-trued again. But I'm going to move this out of the way, move my tool rest out of the way as well, and I'm going to actually power sand this because I want to use my 2-inch disc holder to give myself a nice smooth radius on the base. And anytime I can use a power sander, I'm going to, because it's a lot quicker than using the paper. So drop your speed down. Right now we're at about 1,000 RPM. And I want to be very delicate with the amount of pressure I use with the drill. It's easy to lose a little bit of the touch you have with how much pressure you're using on the drill, and you can snap that tenon off inside the base. So obviously, if you're sanding, make sure you wear a dust mask whenever you do that. but that disc holder is giving us a really good transition. I still have a little bit of bevel mark there that I'm going to get rid of, and then we can sand the base on the edge. Okay, got rid of the tool marks there. Make sure my drill's in a trailing position now that I'm on the exterior. And then I'm just going to gently radius that curve as well. And I will soften up that rim that's just a little sharp. Nothing too crazy. Then we can go on to a finer grit. Okay, sand the rim again. Now that we've done that, I'm going to grab some shavings and burnish this as well. Again, I'm not using the scratch free this time because I'm putting a spray lacquer on it. I don't want it to strip the surface of the wax for that finish to bond correctly. Most finishes with a solvent base, the scratch free and the Yorkshire Grit aren't a problem, but for the spray lacquer it will be. So, but you can see just how good of a surface we have there with the burnish and the nice sandpaper. So to finish this, I'm going to pull this off the tenon slightly, just enough to give ourselves clearance to make sure we get spray lacquer on the front piece here. I'm not concerned with getting spray lacquer down in the drilled hole because that's where I want the epoxy to go. So I'm just going to leave that on the tenon, and then this will give us a nice stable base to apply our coats of spray lacquer. Anytime you use spray lacquer, make sure that the can has been in the house and warmed up to room temperature, 70 degrees or so. It also helps if you put this in a pot of hot water, you know, not boiling water, but just some warm water. It'll help make everything be a little bit smoother spray, and that way it doesn't leave speckles or drips as well. Make sure you shake this up really good. And ideally, you'd spray this outside. That way you're not getting your shop covered with spray lacquer, plus the fumes are pretty bad. So you will want to use, if you're doing this in your house or something, make sure you have good dust collection, air movement, as well as a good respirator for chemicals as well. So, or otherwise just go spray it outside. So first coat, I'm just going to spray it on my rag and make sure that the lacquer's flowing correctly. And the first coat is just a nice light dusting coat. I don't want to go too heavy on the spray lacquer, or else I'll have a really heavy drip and run I'll have to turn off. But these are nice. They upgraded the nozzle on these Master's Magic cans, so I get a lot more even, consistent spray than they used to have. The nice thing about using spray lacquer for a finish is, one, it's really durable, has a super high gloss. You can cut and polish it to be even glossier, but it's fairly quick. The other nice thing too is it just enhances the natural color of the wood. It doesn't darken it. It doesn't have an amber tone to it like Waterlox does, which would leave a browner finish to it. But for stemware pieces like this, spray lacquer is a really good option as well, especially if they're going to get in contact with water when you're washing the glass. But for my first coat, I'm just making sure I have a nice consistent coverage, and that'll be my base coat for all the subsequent coats to tack to. So I'll let this sit here for about 15 minutes. The studio is about 72 degrees or so. 15 minutes for the first coat, and then we'll come back and put on another coat, and then we'll be ready to go. All right, so it's been about 15 minutes, and this coat is dry to the touch. So let's go ahead and put on our second and final coat. You can do more coats if you'd like. Just rotating that lathe by hand. Make sure you get that fillet on the end there. Biggest mistake I see when guys use spray lacquer is they just sit there and hold the nozzle down. You're going to get runs if you do that, so you don't want to. Try and avoid that as best as possible. Give that can a good shake if it's not spraying well. Okay. Alright, so that's going to be our final coat. Once this cures, it might have a little bit of an orange peel texture to it, and if you don't like that, you can cut and polish that with some really fine abrasives like the Micro Magic or the ultra fine Yorkshire Grit. We'll let this dry and then we'll come back and look at it and see if we need to polish it at all, but let's give it about 15 minutes to an hour. Alright, so we've waited 24 hours for this last coat to fully cure. If I take this off, I can see there's a little bit of an orange peel texture I want to polish out. We'll use the Yorkshire Grit. This is the ultra fine. You can use this or the Micro Magic to do this. But we have a really good coat on there. Now we can just refine that surface just a little bit. And to do that, we'll put this back and seat this on the tenon fully. And because there's spray lacquer on the exposed bit of tenon we have, it's actually a little bit tighter of a fit than I expected. And it looks like it's running fairly true. So we'll use the Yorkshire Grit, polish this out, and then we can go ahead and glue in our glass, and then we're going to be done with this project. So I'm going to get my safety glasses back on, and we'll turn the speed on a little bit slower than we were turning. Right now that's about 800 RPM. I'm going to bump that up. It's just a little bit out of true, so I don't want to go too fast. I want to go fast enough that we can get the polishing action we need, but slow enough that it's not going to cause any damage if it starts getting out around too far. When you're polishing, make sure you're not putting a lot of lateral pressure on this because that tenon is only 3/8. If you get too crazy on the pressure, you might snap that off. Just going to stop the lathe and make sure that we're getting the polishing that we need. It's looking pretty good. And all we're looking to do is smooth out and refine that surface of clear coat that we have on there, just like a car. Whenever they spray a clear coat on the car, you want to polish and buff it out. Get rid of any orange peel texture. And like we talked about before, to minimize that orange peel effect, make sure that that can is room temperature or a little warmer, and that'll help those lacquer particles flow a little more freely and be a little smoother when they hit the piece. Use a paper towel and get down in that corner of the fillet there. Just get a clean section of rag now and just buff off any of that wax. And we should be good. Let's go ahead and remove this now. Spin that as you pull it off if it's a little tight. There we go. Now we've got a nice glossy finish. There's just a touch of orange peel, but I think that still looks pretty good. Now we're ready to go ahead and glue in our glass. Alright, now we're ready to glue the glass into the base. And I'm going to be using an RTV silicone adhesive. The reason I'm using this is because this will give me some flex. If the wood moves at all, it's not going to break the glass. As well, it is more removable than an epoxy, so if I do break the glass somehow down the road, I can still pull it out probably and save the base. So I've just cut the nozzle on there to a small 45, and then I'm going to coat the inside of that hole evenly. And then that chamfer that we made for the glass to seat up against. The other nice thing too is you can use mineral spirits or turpentine, I believe, to clean this up if you get silicone where you don't want it. But once I have that coated, I'm going to twist the glass as I put it into place, and then make sure that's fully seated. And I'll let that sit for 24 hours and fully cure, and then this is ready to go. So we've had fun doing a nice little wine glass. If you have any comments or suggestions, leave them in the comment section below. Also, we're always looking for different ideas and different projects to do, so make sure you comment on another video you'd like to see. Thanks, guys.